Welcome to Dr. Dayna Lee-Baggley Session 1, Stream 1, Talk Today. I am your moderator, Liz Pia. If you're looking for a different session, you'll be able to find all the sessions in the menu on the left. Click on the session tab and click on the session that you're interested in attending today. I am pleased to introduce the speaker for this session, Dr. Dayna Lee-Baggley. She specializes in behavior change, both to encourage better health in individuals and to create healthier workplaces. She has close to 40 peer-reviewed publications and over 150 scholarly presentations, as well as an active research program on behavior change, resilience, acceptance, and commitment therapy. Welcome, Dr. Dayna Lee-Baggley. We are looking forward to your talk today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen and just let me know if you can't see the slides advanced for any reason. So I'm going to be talking about basically the science of behavior change and how we can make use of this in intimate partner violence and domestic violence. I will be using the terms he and she because that's most common, but always recognizing that there are many other ways of identifying our own gender and gender identity, as well as intimate partner violence that happens in lots of different combinations. I'm a registered psychologist in Nova Scotia, Ontario, Alberta, and BC. And I also do research at Dalhousie University and St. Mary's University. And that's really about behavior change in individuals and also behavior change in workplaces to leverage the workplace as a resource for health. So the things I'm going to be talking about today are kind of evidence-based, the science of behavior change and how we can make use of that, while also recognizing that that's my own personal bias, which is research, and research, the Institute of Research has its own problems. There's also many ways of understanding the world that are also valid. This is just one perspective we can take. So first, I'm going to talk a bit about how we can foster change. So one important aspect about understanding change is that there's different levels of readiness for change. Not everybody is ready for change. And we have different levels of readiness depending on what behavior we're talking about. And so we like to talk about it in terms of a traffic light, that there's green light, you're ready for change, yellow light, ambivalent for change, and red light, not ready for change. And this, I think, is helpful. It's based on the same model as like the Prochaska model of change, but I find it a bit easier. It's easier to understand for ourselves as well as to have a shared language, and that there's no right or wrong. People show up in different stages of readiness, and that's really normal and understandable. In fact, the most normal most common way we show up is yellow light, which is that there are some pros and cons of change. And so in green light, we kind of logically think there's a problem, emotionally think there's a problem, we want to change, and now's the right time to change. And so most of our interventions are actually designed for, behaviors that are green light. But again, the most common way to show up is yellow light, which is that there are advantages and there are costs to change. And so there are things that can be helpful about change, but there's also costs around change. And then red light is that they don't see it as a problem. They're often not there because of their own choice, but they're there because somebody else is telling them to be there. And so it's important to recognize what state people are in about which behavior, because we actually want to proceed differently. We actually know that we can match different treatments with people's readiness for change. If they're green light, then we can go with many of our standard interventions. But yellow light and red light, we actually need to do different types of interventions. And these are all things that we do training in our clinic for healthcare providers, for therapists, for counselors, around what to do around yellow and red light. But just to recognize that it's not the same thing we do when people are green light. Now, in order to think about it in this way, we actually have to be thinking about it from sort of an analytical, logical perspective. It's also helpful to understand how humans are hardwired and that we don't always approach things from logical, analytical perspectives. So if we understand a bit about humans, first there's part of our brain, I just refer to it as our survival mind. It's responsible for things like emotions, automatic thoughts, learning, memory, pain regulation. And this part of our brain is built for survival. So it gives awesome advice if you are a cave person and your life expectancy is 30 and the kinds of threats you deal with are bear attacks. It also functions automatically and unconsciously, so you can't turn it on and you can't turn it off. Things coming out of this part of our system are automatic. When people are caught in a cycle of violence, basically your survival mind is on fire. There is ongoing threat in your environment, and the system has activated as it's supposed to. As millions of years of evolution have shaped it to do, it is ready to respond to that threat. And so there are many adaptations that people develop to survive in those kinds of threatening environments. And so many of the things that we might think of or perceive as being sort of dysfunctional or maintaining the problem are actually adaptations that are very key for survival. And they are appropriate adaptations if you can't escape that environment. If you are in a threatening environment, those are appropriate things to do to survive and to protect yourself. And so, again, we know statistically that leaving an abusive relationship or leaving a relationship where there's intimate partner violence is the most dangerous part. That's the part where the woman is most likely to be harmed or killed. And so she's not wrong. Her mind and thinking about this as a dangerous system isn't wrong. And it's really helpful and important to recognize that these are adaptations that people have made to survive in that environment. It's the same thing for children growing up in abusive environments. We learn how to survive in those environments. We actually want to acknowledge that those are important things to do if you don't have a means of getting out of those abusive environments, and not everybody has that sense that they have the ability to leave. The other relevant part of our brain would be our prefrontal cortex, and this is where executive functioning happens. And this is things like starting behavior, stopping behavior, planning, delaying gratification. This is where willpower comes from, where self-control comes from. And unlike our survival mind that's always working, our frontal lobe is like a battery. And so we'll wear out that battery of self-control as we use it up. And that's why things like binge eating are more likely to happen in the evenings compared to the mornings, because we've used up that battery of self-control. This part of your brain has to be on or activated or charged to be able to make behavior change. The kinds of things that we are trying to get people to do, whether they are victims or perpetrators of violence, you need to have an engaged frontal lobe. You need to be making conscious, deliberate, effortful choices. They are not things that your caveman brain is going to do. Your survival brain is going to do things automatically. And so this part needs to be activated. It needs to be charged for people to make change. And so if you are stuck in a cycle of violence where that threat system is overactivated, for good reason, because your environment actually is dangerous, it is very difficult for this part of our brain to have enough battery to overcome that survival mechanism that's in play. Because again, it's like having a survival mind on fire. And so that level of readiness often can't happen if you can't get your frontal lobe activated, because the threat system is overly activated, and again, for really good reasons. And so we often can't logic our way out of these scenarios. It might logically seem like there is a safe exit for that person, but that doesn't mean that they can see that if they're stuck in the threat system. And so we have these different ways that our minds kind of can be focused. There is a threat focus system. This is about protection and safety seeking. It's very activating and inhibiting, related to feelings like anger, anxiety, and fear. And it actually gives us tunnel vision. And this is on purpose. So when you are facing a threat, that is not the moment to brainstorm 101 possible ways to deal with a bear attack. If you're facing a bear attack, you should just pick one and go with it. And so the threat focus system deliberately gives us tunnel vision. It makes us think we only have options A or B, that's all I've got. And even when we try to offer other suggestions or solutions, they're like, that can't happen. I can't do that, because we're stuck in that threat system. This is, of course, the system that is overly activated in response to trauma or a dangerous environment. And we say overly activated, but it's actually appropriately activated for the level of danger in their environment. It's also responsible for the fight, flight, or freeze response. We often can understand, we have an understanding of what the fight response looks like. That's when people are being aggressive, activated. The flight is also that need to escape, the desire to get away. And then there's also a freeze system that's part of this, which people really misunderstand. If you're at extreme levels of threat, our systems are designed to enter a freeze mode, because fight or flight takes up so much energy that if you can't escape this danger, it actually switches us into freeze or immobility. And so often in dangerous situations, we end up immobilized. And it's really important for us to understand that, for people who've experienced violence to understand that you don't always have the ability to fight back. Often if you're in the freeze system, that has actually removed your ability to fight back. It's not that you should have fought off your attacker and you didn't. If you're in the freeze response, which is the normal human response, it has deactivated your ability to fight back, and it's not a choice. This is part of an automatic system. People can often seem, disengaged, numb. This is, again, a normal response as part of that threat system. There's also a resource-focused system, which is about wanting, pursuing, achieving, and consuming. It's activating, associated with drive, excitement, and vitality. For our purposes, we're not going to go into too much detail about this one. And then there's a social engagement system, which is a social focus system. And this system is about safeness and kindness, associated with feelings of content, soothing, connection. This is when we're actually our most creative, when you can brainstorm all kinds of different ideas. It actually gets us out of that tunnel vision when we're in this social engagement system. It is an automatic effect of being in the social engagement system that we start to see that more options are possible and they're viable, and things that before seemed impossible to do now suddenly seem possible. This is when we're most courageous, because most willing to go outside our comfort zone and do new things, because there is that safeness underneath. There is that protection about social safety that has been engaged. And this is a biological factor of humans, this social engagement system. And it's because humans are the most social creatures on the planet, and there's a biological need for this. So if you watch other mammals being born, the babies are much more functional at birth. So if you watch a horse being born, for example, it will get up within minutes of being born, and it'll be ready to run with the herd, fairly soon after being born. How about human babies? Human babies are not nearly so functional. Human babies actually are born much more helpless than other mammals, and studies show that they don't catch up to other mammals until about 18 months. So a horse on the day it's born has the same kind of maturation as a human baby at 18 months. And this is, again, a biological trade-off, because our big brains were really helpful for survival. But the point at which babies are born now is the last point you can get that big skull out the birth canal. And so human babies are basically born too soon. And so you need a system to ensure that someone is caring for these helpless infants, literally for the survival of the species. If you don't figure this out, the human species does not survive, because human babies do not survive on their own. And this is the attachment system, which is where this social engagement system, where it comes from. And it's basically hardwired into humans. So it starts first with, parents or caregivers and infants, but it persists throughout our life, that hardwiring in humans, that we naturally, automatically feel comforted, feel safe, feel more capable of handling things when that social engagement system has been activated. And so there's a lot of biology about this. If you've heard anything about polyvagal theory, this is part of the biology of how these systems happen, that basically you can have that fight or flight response. Again, if it gets into very serious threat, then it will activate the freeze response. And the way to actually deactivate that system is through the social engagement system. When we activate that social engagement system, it can deactivate that fight or flight response. Again, not from kind of a logical talk your way out of it kind of way, but from a biology of human nature to activate a sense of safety and calmness and groundedness, because we've activated that social engagement system. And it's just a reminder, again, about the pandemic that just apparently won't ever end, that even though we would like to have the pandemic over, I would too, it seems to keep causing us stress. And so it's just a reminder that in the pandemic, our survival minds are on fire and our frontal lobe batteries are spent. There's ongoing threat that we don't have control over. Survival brains hate uncertainty, and it's even more. There seems to be just more and more uncertainty as we move our way through the pandemic. And so our survival minds are on fire. Again, this is an automatic system. You don't have to be worrying about the pandemic for this system to activate. As well, our frontal lobe batteries are spent. It takes way more effort to get through a COVID day than non-COVID day. And there continues to be new and different behaviors that we have to manage as we work our way through this. And so we understandably do not have as much frontal lobe batteries to control our behavior in other realms. So we will see, in clinical practice, we see people relapsing. At this point, I like to say there's no frontal lobes anywhere, that people are not functioning from their best selves because we're just basically all so exhausted. And we want to, acknowledge the impact of the pandemic that keeps having a role on us. We also know from research that stress impairs things like concentration, memory, attention, problem solving, and decision making. So this isn't because we're not trying hard enough. This is a well-established effect of stress on the brain. So again, when people are under stress in the threat system, they aren't remembering things well. They can't problem solve well. Their executive functioning is not online because their survival brains are on fire. And that is an appropriate response when you are in danger. And so it's just, again, a reminder about managing the pandemic too, is that we might not be able to control the stress of the pandemic, but we can think about charging our frontal lobe. And so a recharging activity is something that makes you feel more energetic at the end than when you started. So common ones for most people would be things like sleep, eating healthy food, staying hydrated, physical activity, being in nature, and social connection. But there's also individual differences. So for an extrovert, being with other people can be recharging. For an introvert, that might be draining. There's also probably an optimal amount. Going for a walk for 30 minutes might be recharging. Going for 6 hours might be draining. This isn't the same thing as doing some healthy habits. So we're not trying to add on a list of things that you should be doing. It's about something that makes you smile, something that makes you feel a bit lighter. And so it's also just a reminder for providers, we're also worn out by the pandemic, and we also want to make sure we're recharging our frontal lobe. We do a lot of work with healthcare providers on managing burnout and on leaders and managing burnout. And you want to remind yourself that it's not just you that you're charging your frontal lobe for. Everyone you interact with, everyone who matters to you, this is who benefits from you having a charged frontal lobe. If you ask yourself, who benefits from me having a charged frontal lobe? Probably everyone who matters to you and everyone who's important to you. And so these are the reasons why we want to recharge our battery. And to keep in mind that, clients, patients, people we're working with also are low on frontal lobe battery, and you need that to be able to make change. So when we're trying to make change, we can make change in a smarter way by making use of what we know about the science of behavior change to improve sustained behavior change. And so here are some factors that we know increase the likelihood of people being able to make change. And whether that's something about recharging their batteries or taking better care of themselves or something as significant as leaving an abusive relationship, this is all behavior change that we're asking people to do. Including, drugs and alcohol use. All of these things are all behavior change. So our first tip is to make sure you pick a behavioral goal. This is really important because we often pick feeling or motivational goals. I don't want to think bad thoughts. I don't want to have cravings for alcohol. I don't want to feel bad about myself. But these are all things governed by our survival mind. And so if you're trying to change something coming out of your survival mind, you inevitably will be in trouble because we don't have direct control over that. We can do things that change it, but we don't have direct control. And so picking a behavioral goal is important because your frontal lobe battery is responsible for behavior. It's a different part of our brain that controls behavior. And so we're much more likely to be able to succeed because we're focused on something we actually have direct control over. Now, we don't have unlimited control over behavior, and many conditions like chronic pain, depression, anxiety, ADHD, all of these things impact our ability to control behavior, but we have much more control over behavior than we do thoughts or feelings. The next one is to pick a 90% goal, which means something that you're 90% sure that you can succeed at. Otherwise, make it something smaller, less frequent, less intense. And this is because success breeds success. When we feel like we're succeeding at something, we want to keep going. We feel like we're failing, we want to stop. That's just normal human behavior. And so sometimes we pick the goals for our clients when they're actually much too big for them. They are not a 90% goal for them. And this includes things like having the goal for somebody to leave an abusive relationship. That might be way too big of a goal for them. It may not be anywhere near a 90% goal for them. So pick things that they can succeed at. And again, what's the 90% goal in the pandemic is probably different than what's a 90% goal pre-pandemic. Pick a do instead goal. So if I were to tell you to not think about pink elephants, you would suddenly notice yourself thinking about pink elephants or having to work really hard to not think about pink elephants. There's a well-established effect in psychology called the thought suppression effect, that the more we try to not think about something, the more we think about it. And we often set don't do goals, and what we're doing is creating pink elephants. It's very true around addictions work where we're trying to stop drinking or stop using drugs. These are all pink elephants you're creating. What are you going to do instead of drinking? What are you going to do instead of using drugs? And again, make sure it's a 90% goal. Leaving a relationship or don't go back to him. Again, thinking about what is the do instead goal and making sure it's a realistic amount for people, because you're going to need that frontal lobe battery to make change. And then plan for setbacks. People are often distressed when someone they're working with goes back to an abusive relationship, but this is exactly what we expect in terms of behavior change. That one, it may have been too big of a goal for them to sustain in the long term, and that we anticipate people are going to have setbacks. Actually, there's a lot of research showing that when we can be kind to ourselves in the face of setbacks, that actually allows us to get back on track more quickly, to get back to kind of moving forward with our behavior change. And so we're trying, this is true of like addictions or things like that as well, where we're not trying, you will fall off the wagon. Our goal is to get back onto the wagon as quickly as possible. And it's a different skill set to get back onto the wagon than to avoid falling off. And it's not a realistic expectation for most people to avoid falling off. And so when somebody is green light, when they're ready for change, we can set goals that are much more likely to be sustained if we use the science of behavior change. And often in working in, domestic violence, people are often consumed by the idea of getting them out of an abusive relationship, which of course makes sense that that's what we want to do. But there are many, many other behaviors that we can help people with that can eventually lead to that, that will help them build success and feel confident about themselves on the way to get there. So again, when we're stuck in that threat system, this kind of behavior change is very difficult to do because your caveman brain is on fire. And so there are things that we can do to help shift people out of the threat system and into the social safety system. So the first one that we know will help make that shift is compassion. And compassion is about an awareness of suffering and a desire to alleviate it. So this definition is really important because it's actually about connecting through the suffering, about what's hard, about the struggle, about what is difficult. And we know that when people feel heard, validated, and seen over the painful, difficult parts, the parts that they are ashamed of, the parts that they are struggling with, that's actually what builds compassion, and that's actually what shifts people out of that threat system and into the social safety system. And so there's a lot of research, showing the impact of compassion around many topics related to intimate partner violence, domestic violence, trauma. And so we know that this can have an impact in helping people in this domain as well. And one of the key things that we want to do is to validate, period. And I like to say validation ends in a period. It doesn't include a but. And so, again, when people feel heard and understood and validated and not judged, that's when they can shift out of that threat system and into the social safety system. A really important thing that we don't want to do in working with people who are victims of violence is, again, to re-traumatize them and to set an expectation where they have to leave that relationship or they're doing something bad to themselves or to their kids because they won't leave that abusive relationship is actually just keeping them in the threat system. We actually want to validate, period, their experiences, which again, they are probably doing many appropriate adaptations to survive in, a violent environment. And we actually want to validate that. We want to validate their reasons for staying. People often can't understand their reasons for staying. That's the part that you want to validate and to connect with. Connecting with that doesn't mean that we're endorsing the behavior. Validating it, validating their experience is not the same thing as validating their beliefs. They might not think that they have the ability to leave. We don't have to validate that belief that they can't leave, but we can validate that they feel scared and that they do things to try to cope in a dangerous environment. And those are probably things that are helping to keep them alive in those violent situations. And so we know that when we actually can engage that social engagement system, it changes our perception of the world. And this is, again, this sense that you can be more creative, that you're more courageous, that you're, more willing for change when that social engagement system is activated. So, for example, they have studies where they have people stand at the bottom of a hill and estimate how tall the hill is. And if you're standing there by yourself compared to standing there with loved ones, we estimate the height of the hill as being taller when we're there by ourselves than if we're there with loved ones. They have studies where they have people carry a backpack and estimate the weight of the backpack. And even though they're not going to help you, if you're there with loved ones, we will estimate the weight of the backpack as weighing less than if we're there by ourselves. Then they have ones where they have people in a functional MRI machine and they administer a standardized shock to their toes. And basically you can see the pain receptors of the brain light up. And if you're holding the hand of a loved one, your pain receptors literally do not light up as much as if you're there by yourself. Now, if you're holding the hand of someone you have a distressed relationship with, it's actually worse than being there by yourself. So again, this is not about the value of being with somebody no matter what. This is the value of having safe, trusting relationships. When you have safe, trusting relationships, that social engagement system is activated. And the obstacles don't seem as big, the burdens don't seem as heavy, and the pain doesn't seem as bad. It's not because we fundamentally changed anything. It's because when we have activated that social engagement system, we feel more capable. We feel like we can handle things more. And absolutely, first responders, providers, therapists, support workers can do things to activate that social engagement system in the people that they're working with. And that actually helps them believe that they can handle things that they didn't think they could handle before. But that isn't about, again, telling them what they should do or that there's an ultimate goal they have to get to. This is about making them feel heard and validated and that they're doing their best in a really difficult situation. And so I often say that compassion, this compassion begins with a reality check, that many of the things that cause our suffering in life are not our choice and not our fault. It is our responsibility, but by responding compassionately about the reasons we got into this difficult situation can actually, again, produce some compassion and actually allow us to be better able to take responsibility and to make change. And so there are many things, if you are a woman caught up in an abusive relationship, again, we often take that on as our own fault. We're doing something wrong. If I just did something different or better, he wouldn't do this to me. It's my fault that I can't leave. But there are many factors that lead people to being in an abusive relationship that are not our choice and not our fault. So we didn't choose to have, a survival mind that's going to activate and make it difficult to make change when we're under threat. We didn't choose to be born male, female, or any of the other versions in between there. We didn't choose to be born in this culture. We didn't choose to be born in this era. We didn't choose to be born in, a cultural environment that endorses violence and makes it possible to have violence against women or for men, to enact violence against women. And so those are all factors that influence whether you end up in an abusive relationship. And clearly for many people of color, people in poverty, Indigenous groups, there are many things that have happened that are definitely not their choice and not their fault that continue to impact them. And so again, we actually want to respond compassionately to that because it actually allows us to calm down that survival mind. if we, that self-criticism comes from our survival mind. If you fuel it, then you will again have a survival mind on fire, and there's even less battery available to make choices. When we can respond compassionately to ourselves, when we can respond compassionately to the people we're working with, this actually will free up some frontal lobe battery, because it's not our choice, it's not our fault, but it is our responsibility, and we're balancing those two things together. And so we know that guilt, shame, blame doesn't work. And this is true for both the victims and the perpetrators of violence. And so when people feel judged, when they feel like they're not doing the right thing, when they feel guilt and shame, that results in defensive and avoidant behaviors, and it results in those same survival behaviors. Shame makes us want to hide. It's the thing that silences us. And so we, as the providers, as the people interacting with people experiencing violence, do not want to contribute to that shame by putting some judgment about whether they should leave or not, or whether they should be putting up with those behaviors or not, because that is just sending them back into shame and blame. And we don't change when we're in that threat system. It's, again, just reactivating the threat system. And so this is not giving people a pass. It is responding with compassion in order to help them make behaviors and make choices that are better for them. It's not, it's to free up some of that frontal lobe battery. And so we know that for long-term change, humans need to be moving towards something that matters and not just getting away from something bad. And so when we think about the analogy about a carrot versus a stick, and so I grew up in Calgary, and there's a famous Calgary Stampede, and my favorite horses in the parade were the Clydesdale horses, which are these huge, magnificent, beautiful horses. Now, if you want to get one of these Clydesdale horses to move, you can use a stick or a carrot. If you beat the horse with a stick, the horse will move. But over time, what does that do to the horse? And how does the horse feel about the owner? And as one of my friends said, who has horses, she said, yeah, and when you take the stick away, that horse ain't doing a damn thing for you. And so it will work, but it doesn't result in long-term change. It's not the kind of thing that results in sustained change. Whereas if we're moving towards a carrot, if we're moving towards what matters, if we're moving towards things that are important to us, that can result in long-term change. And this is true for both, again, victims and perpetrators, that we can't just have them stuck in cycles of shame and blame and guilt. That won't result in long-term change. It can't be about being a bad person or not doing the right thing. It has to be about moving towards something that matters, about something that is good, something that is meaningful and purposeful to them. That is what results in long-term change. And so the other part is that we actually know that compassion and this kind of work actually helps the providers too. So we know that it is a very difficult space to work in. If you have support providers, first responders, therapists, counselors, it is a difficult space to work in intimate partner violence or domestic violence. But what we actually know is that from research is that empathy is actually multidimensional. So often what providers are told is that they simply, don't bring it home with you. You shouldn't feel emotional about it. Don't get caught up in it. But actually there are different forms of empathy that have different impacts on the providers. So there's perspective taking as a form of empathy, which is basically a cognitive kind of logical, it's probably your frontal lobe, thinking about what that would be like to be in that situation. There's also empathic concern, which is an emotional response, kind of emotionally feeling what that would be like for that person. And then there's personal distress. And what the research shows is that empathic concern is actually a protective factor. It's actually the thing that makes the work meaningful and purposeful, is having those personal connections with people, of having those moments of connection. I don't have any data on it, but my guess is that that form of empathy is actually the social engagement system. It's that we've connected with people, again, through the struggle, through suffering, through what is hard, but our social engagement systems are activated. Personal distress is the part which is predictive of burnout over time. And that's where we sort of take on the distress ourselves, like it's happening to us. And my guess, again, I don't have any data on it, is that that's when our alarm system, when our threat system is activated. So we're connecting through the threat system instead of connecting through the social engagement system. And so personal distress is predictive of burnout over time, but empathic concern is actually protective. And again, it's the thing that makes this kind of work worthwhile, is having those connections with people, not because we've fixed it, not because we've, solved everything, but because we have connected with them in their moment of suffering, in this place that is scary, that they're ashamed of, that they don't want anyone to see, that we are seeing them still as worthwhile human beings that we're ready to connect with. And then when we talk about, issues around burnout for staff who work in domestic violence, we also just want to recognize that there are organizational causes of burnout. So again, I have done work in burnout for a long time, and we've actually shifted to do all of our interventions not about self-care for employees, but actually about leadership training and systemic factors that influence burnout, because there are well-established organizational causes of burnout. So we know that things like unsustainable workload, perceived lack of control, insufficient rewards, lack of support in community, lack of fairness, and mismatched values. These are all things that are organizational causes of burnout, and we do want organizations to step up and to contribute to making sure that they're addressing these factors as well. And so, again, we've started doing work on trauma-informed workplaces, which is not just trauma-informed, treatment, but actually how do you make workplaces environments that aren't triggering and that are supportive of growth and healing for people who've experienced trauma. This is true that many people have experienced trauma in their own lives. Certainly providers often experience vicarious trauma through the work that they're doing. And of course, many people have now experienced trauma because of having to live through the pandemic. So psychological safety is the thing we're working on in workplaces, and that's about leadership and teams, again, system level factors. And psychological safety in the workplace is that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to speak up and disagree. And so again, there are evidence-based ways that leaders can show up, that teams can function, so that they are creating psychological safety in the workplace. And this is the other thing that we need workplaces to do, especially workplaces where we are treating people experiencing domestic violence. And so this brings me to the last point, which is about how do we make system level changes. Many of the things that lead to domestic violence are, again, system level problems. It's not just that one victim and perpetrator, that there are societal factors that contribute to this. And so addressing system level factors is how do we move from me to we. We will never make change just as individuals. We have to do it in a group. That is how you make system level changes. And our first step is actually always just bringing up awareness that it's not okay, awareness that there is a problem. Again, I went to Jackson Katz's talk at the beginning of this day today, and again, addressing that men end up being victims of a misogynistic world as well, that they are the recipients of violence as well. Raising awareness about these things is a meaningful contribution to system level problems. And again, this is a great quote, I think, that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so we know that groups can make change, but you can't do it all by yourself. And so when we're thinking about system level problems, again, we need to recognize we're all stuck in the system. Both perpetrators, victims, first responders, police, everybody is stuck in the system. We are all controlled by the system. We all contribute to the system, and yet we're all not the system. And so recognizing that everybody's behavior ends up being controlled by the system. So we're not trying to direct this at an individual. We're not trying to direct it at certain people or professions, that these are all system level problems. It's often helpful to clarify our intent, that we're bringing this up, to try to improve the system, to recognize that we're all part of the system. We want to frame that up in terms of being consistent with our own values around, again, moving towards something that matters, not just getting away from something bad. And that recognize that success is talking about the system level problems, not necessarily changing the system. Changing the system might actually look different than what you thought it was going to look like. And so make sure you have connections with people who share similar values so you don't feel isolated or by yourself in trying to make those changes. And again, the bystander intervention is a great example of system level change, which isn't about directly targeting the people, doing engaging in violence, but the environment around them. And so recognize that for anybody else to change, there needs to be something in it for them. Again, if we just are using shame and blame to try to get people to change, this doesn't result in change. It's not effective. And I love the example that was given earlier about talking about it in terms of leadership, because again, that's about it, rather than don't be an abusive male, it's actually about be someone in leadership. And this is the moving towards something that matters, that this is how we work on, burnout prevention in healthcare workers, because they don't think of themselves as people that they should take care of themselves. They're used to taking care of patients. We don't do treatments on burnout. We do leadership training, and leadership training is training them about ways to take care of themselves and take care of their staff and employees. And so these are the kinds of things that we want to think about in terms of system level change. So I'm going to just wrap up here. So these are just a few additional resources. This is a book that I wrote, which is again about my values of trying to increase access to science-based information. It's specifically for people with chronic disease about how you make healthy habit changes, but talking about the science of that. And our clinic does a lot of other training, including things like trauma-informed leadership training, burnout leadership training, as well as treatment, training for therapists and intimate partner violence, behavior change, and motivational interviewing. And we do have a pandemic burnout intervention available on our website now, because again, everybody is worn out. So that's my contact information, and I will stop there and see if there are questions or comments.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Dayna Lee-Baggley, for sharing your expertise. It was actually really informative. We do have one question. It's, if you don't mind, Dayna, we're going to be ending promptly at 11:45. But the question from Carrie is, how do we get families to access the social focus system when they are constantly in the flight, fight, freeze?
Yeah, so I mean, there are actual interventions that have been developed for families, for parents, especially around like environments where there's been a lot of abuse. And so there are like evidence kind of based and theoretically driven interventions that you can look into about how you do that. At a very basic, the first step is for the therapist themselves to make sure they're in the social engagement system, to make sure that they're, not in a threat system, that they're welcoming and open. And it's not calm and sort of like the calm, cool, and collected. It's calm in terms of it's safe. You're safe here. It's safe to make mistakes. It's safe to be a flawed human. That's the kind of calmness that we're aiming for, not kind of calm, cool, and collected, because that actually is disengaging for others. And so, your first step is for, as a therapist, am I embodying that? And even just things like watching your own breathing. Are you holding your breath? Are you taking deep breaths? Are you nodding? Are you engaging? These are some of the basic kinds of things that activate that social engagement system for others. There's also, very specific interventions that have been developed to help families, especially families where there's violence, to get out of that threat system and to activate the social engagement system that, are available as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, definitely the calmness, grounding, laughter. Laughter was a really key point that really resonated with me. I had a practitioner that actually said that to me one day, just laugh. And now I'm actually aware that I need to laugh more. So that's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We're down to 2 minutes, but I don't want to get cut off. But I just wanted to mention to the group that we're going to be breaking for lunch, and we'll resume at 1 p.m. So I invite everyone to return to the lobby for up-to-date communications, and also encourage you to visit the trade show hall to gather some great resources. Thank you, Dr. Dayna Lee-Baggley. It was great to have you on, and really appreciate your time. Take care and have a great afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
See you soon, everyone.
Take care.